Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today, we're on a season 6 introduction to Reformed Theology episode, and we have Shane Rosenthal helping us today. You guys may recognize his name from White Horse Inn, and I'll let Peter further introduce him here in a moment. But he's going to be helping us with the topic of covenant of grace. And so this is a very important topic, and it's added to our season 6 introduction to Reformed theology as a topic we know that we must know, teach, learn. And so Shane is definitely going to help us understand this better and articulate it. So if you go to our show notes, there's some information, links, that kind of thing about Shane Rosenthal. And then also some information about Westminster Seminary, California. So if you've been listening to this season, you'll know all our guests are affiliated in some way, shape, or form to Westminster Seminary, California. So there's a link there. This season's pretty much dedicated to that seminary school. And so you're going to learn more information about that school in San Diego, California. And then also just basic show note information that we have on every episode, how to connect with Peter and myself, learn a little bit more basics about our show. We're on Twitter and Instagram. We have an email, and we're on YouTube. So you can watch these videos on YouTube as well. And then also just if you need to find a church to call home and join as a member, we have a link to help you out. It's a local church finder. So you click that, type in your zip code for one of the, choose between many different Reformed denominations, find one closest to your area, and that way you can pay them a visit. And so I'll let Peter further introduce Shane Rosenthal, our guest today.
Yeah, we have Shane Rosenthal, who's the founder and host of the Humble Skeptic podcast. And as his bio says, though he was raised in a Jewish home, he became an atheist at a young age, but later in college, he ended up losing faith in atheism and converted to Christianity. He was one of the creators of the national radio broadcast called the White Horse Inn, and many of you may have heard of him from that podcast, which also he hosted from 2019 to 2021, which is really around the time that I started listening more intently to it. And he has written numerous articles for a variety of sites and publications, including Modern Reformation, For Christianity, Table Talk, Logia, the Heidelblog, and others. Shane has also contributed a chapter in the book Defending the Faith, edited by Michael Horton. And he received a BA in Humanities from Cal-State Fullerton, not too far up the road from where I live, an MA in Historical Theology from Westminster Seminary California, which is one of the reasons why we have him on this episode. It's a pleasure having you on, Shane Rosenthal.
Hey, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be with you guys.
Of course, yeah. So first question that was not on the list of questions, because I always like doing a kind of an icebreaker question. What was it like? Because we were just talking pre-recording. One of the episodes that I found, or one of the most consistent episodes that I listened to, and I think people might recognize what I'm talking about, is when you went to conferences for evangelicals and broader Christianity and stuff. What was it like going to those and asking these questions to people who should know the answers and then clearly didn't?
Yeah, those the man on the street segments, I actually started doing that in the early 90s.
Okay.
We were on live radio in KKLA, Los Angeles from like 1990 to 96.
Yeah.
And then after that, we kind of merged with other organizations and we went, recorded it. But there were times in which I would get these man on the street segments as the producer of the show to sort of help the audience see the importance of these issues.
Yeah.
That it's not just theologians talking with each other, but these are real things that are at play in I would go to Christian conventions and sometimes pastoral conventions. And sometimes I'll ask people, what are the 10 commandments? What is justification? What is the doctrine of imputation? One, it was a little bit more, technical for the average Christian, but for a pastoral convention,
should certainly know
they should know that word. And then what happens is the listener would often hear that and they would say, can I answer these basic questions? What is it? And so it makes it real, like both your mouth is sort of hanging open, like, wow, people don't really know their Bibles anymore. But then it makes the listener say, do I know my Bible? So I always thought it was a helpful thing. I always got a lot of positive responses to those, and I've been doing them for almost 30 years. I still do it with my new podcast, Humble Skeptic. I do a lot of that. Man in the Street thing. Recently, I did one in number of places. Let's see. There was a convention. There was a music concert, Christian concert, and I went to a mega church asking people, what is faith? And I got so many different answers. But then I was, then I sort of spend the time interacting with those questions. Is the popular consensus about faith what the Bible actually teaches?
Yeah. So let's, as you want people to get to know the Bible, and as we want people to get to know the Bible, let's get to know you a little bit better. So first thing is maybe let our listeners, beyond your bio, let them know a little bit about yourself.
Well, as the bio states, I was raised in a Jewish background, but became an atheist pretty young in my life. I mean, I just remember thinking religion was a joke. Yeah. In the 3rd, 4th grade, talking with friends, I thought it was, made up. It was a secular Jewish upbringing, so it wasn't terribly important to our family's life. We didn't read the Bible really, but we did go to services sometimes weekly at various points. But I just remember thinking it's all a joke. Then in high school, later after I graduated high school, very early years in college, I remember stumbling on various texts. I began reading, and through conversations I was having at work and in school and my own reading, I ran across some of the Old Testament prophecies about the coming Messiah that I never knew was a thing. I was never told in my Jewish upbringing that there were passages about a Messiah, or that Jesus, kind of fulfilled any of those.
Sure.
The shocking one for me was, out of Bethlehem shall come the one who's ruler and who is ruler of all, whose origins are from everlasting. I was thinking, I've seen the TV specials. The Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but I never knew that there was a promise in the Jewish world that they were looking for a Messiah to come from Bethlehem. Started talking to rabbis. I was not impressed at all with what I heard from the various quarters. They gave me interesting books to read, but I just found the Christian perspective was very compelling, and it sort of made me question my atheism. So I converted to the Christian faith.
That makes
Anyways,
sense.
then that was like 1985. I met Michael Horton in 1987 and began volunteering for this new organization he was, kind of involved with, which is like an organization out of Biola. Eventually, we made that a nonprofit organization that created White Horse Inn and Modern Reformation. And so I've been involved in that for 30-something years. Just last year, I decided to sort of do my own thing, create the show my own way, and a little bit more production value, more like serial NPR-ish, lots of different segments in color and storytelling, almost like a investigative true crime feel, trying to instill curiosity about these important biblical themes, and also cross-cultural. We should not only know what we believe and why we believe it, but we should know what our neighbors believe, and we should think about those important differences. And so just a little bit broader in scope than sort of White Horse Inn. Anyway, that's what I've been doing.
Totally cool.
Yeah, it makes sense that you have that strong interest in seeing Christ in the Old Testament with the background you were talking about.
Yeah.
True. Yeah, that is true. And so like we already talked about beginning of this, as I talked about in your bio, you went to Westminster, and all of season 6 guests are faculty and or alumni from Westminster. We're sponsored by Westminster, so we're trying to do this to help them get the word out, help them get the story out. So I have a 3-parter question. So if you want to answer this in 3 parts, you don't have to answer it all at once. First is, how did you hear about Westminster? And I might have a guess as to how you heard about it. Second is, what was your education like at Westminster? And then thirdly is, how has it prepared you for what you're doing today and what you've been doing for the past 30 years?
Yeah. Well, I knew Mike in the 87 when he was going to Westminster.
That's what I figured. Yeah.
But what's interesting is through the years of, creating the White Horse Inn and Modern Ref, I was basically especially as the managing editor for many years of Modern Ref, I would be working with Michael Horton, and he would submit articles, and then I would mark them up. Here's a suggested edit point, yada yada. Well, in 1998, I decided to step aside for a couple of years from Whitehorse Inn to go to seminary, and I enrolled in Westminster because it's like that's the no-brainer. But that was right at the time Horton finished his postdoctoral work at Yale, and he starts as a professor at Westminster.
Yeah.
So now the tables are totally turned. I'm submitting articles to him, and he's more enjoying the red pen.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, it was a little painful actually. What was my education like there? I was there the tail end of Meredith Klein's tenure.
Yep.
So I got to study under Klein, Dennis Johnson, who's also a very strongly he loves to emphasize Christ in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Robert Godfrey.
Yep.
I thoroughly enjoyed my education there, and it was one of the things that I love about Westminster is just that emphasis on understanding covenant theology, which I know we're going to talk about on this show.
Yep.
But particularly with Klein's emphasis and getting the law gospel stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Horton was very clear on that through the years at Whitehorse Inn and at Westminster. And just a very clear and robust understanding of justification and the objective work of Christ, the objective nature of faith. All those things were just super, super helpful for me. A lot of it I knew because of my work with, Mike over the years.
Sure,
so a lot of it was not new to me, but it was sort of that deeper dive there that, really prepared me for a life of continuing education, continued scholarship in these important, fields.
Yeah. Then how did it prepare you for what you're doing now?
Well, if I was to say, just looking at the 20th century, I mean, in terms of Old Testament background, I am convinced that the most important tool we have is understanding the Bible in its original context.
Yeah.
And the biggest chunk of the Bible is the Old Testament.
Yep.
And the Old Testament helps us to understand the New Testament.
Yep.
But the 20th century, the major figure that I think is super helpful, late 20th century, would be Meredith Klein. Because he really helps you to understand the Old Testament Near Eastern worldview that illuminates these strange things we find in the Bible. And so those categories that we will get into in this conversation, the categories he provides just partly by having us read ancient Near Eastern texts that were not biblical texts, but covenantal suzerainty treaty kind of documents. That was super illuminating in terms of just understanding the structure of the kinds of language we find in the Bible, the kinds of how you interpret these, how the whole Bible ends up forming as a result. If you study the way so-and-so makes a treaty, then they make copies of the treaty, then they have songs of praise to the great suzerain. They implement it into their life, the Code of Hammurabi and all these different kinds of treaties. There's so many parallels to Old Testament themes that you can kind of begin to see how the whole Bible forms as a result of that kind of study. So I just found it extremely helpful and illuminating.
Yeah, bridging to Nick's question to help bear that out, and from your response, I think a lot of Christians, when they start hearing about these things, and you'll see secular scholars bring up some of these documents, like, oh, the Bible copied from these documents,
right?
And then Christians like, well, we can't read that stuff. That's not biblical. That's outside the Bible. We can't interact with that. And then when you actually engage with it, like what you had said that Westminster forces you to do, you say, no, this doesn't disagree. Of course, there's some disagreements with it, but you start, like, you place your mind into the culture of the people that were listening to the Bible at this point.
Yeah.
Okay, I see what they're saying. If I place my culture on top of the Bible's culture, okay, it's not going to make sense. And these things are going to become foreign, versus if I insert myself into their culture, start understanding the cultural milieu around them, this starts making a lot more sense about what's happening.
Most of us today come to the Bible thinking, as narcissistic, secular, Western, Americans who are interested in comfort and stress relief. And I go to the Bible looking for something. What does it mean to me? Subjective. How can it help my life? How can I have my best life now? And if you actually go to the Bible, read it as you would read a second millennia BC suzerainty treaty, it all sort of unfolds. And then it like, oh, it's making sense. The text in its context, what was the language? What did these words mean then?
Yeah.
And then how does it tell the story, the major story, in a dramatic way of the ultimate servant of God? And how does that end up coming to a grand crescendo in the story of Christ? All that is just Westminster really did a great job of helping me to read the Bible that way.
Totally. Yep.
Yeah, before my first question, I would like to add that I didn't go to Westminster Seminary California, but I've benefited from that institution so much. Reformed theology, supported by institutions like Westminster Seminary California, faithfully has really helped introduce doctrines like justification and covenant of grace to me, helping my assurance of salvation so much as a Christian.
Right.
And Michael Horton has helped me tremendously help my assurance with those doctrines, and other people from Westminster Seminary California, and understand Reformed theology more, and especially with my background as Roman Catholic too.
Yeah.
Right.
Where assurance of salvation is a little more, doesn't seem as permanent.
It's by design not permanent.
Yeah. So, and actually the reason why I brought that up, because it bridges into what you're talking about, Shane, and going into covenant theology and understanding the covenant of grace. So my first question is, we're talking about 3 different covenants in our show in this season. We've had episodes on the covenant of redemption with R. Scott Clark. We had covenant of works episode, and now we ask, can you provide a definition of the covenant of grace for the audience? And attached to this question, who are the parties that are part of the covenant of grace, and how does it relate to the other 2 covenants?
Well, let me just back up, and we'll talk about like a covenant in general.
Yeah.
The agreement between different parties. In the way we think about that today, you might have a business agreement or a tenant agreement, and what the key ingredient in for our covenants and agreements is a signature. We got to have that signature on the dotted line. And interestingly enough, when people do come to an agreement, a business deal, they will sometimes say, we cut a deal. It's interesting that language of cut is still there. It goes back actually to the ancient world, where they would literally cut something in a covenant arrangement. And so there are different kinds of covenants. And one of the things that Meredith Klein helped us to see is that like there are some kinds of covenant rituals that are related to it's a single-sided covenant that's related to a gift. So it's a promisorial covenant. I, Mati Ilu, am bequeathing to his servant this land. And it's just a straight gift, and there are no obligations. There's nothing sworn, because it's just a gift. It's a promise and a gift. But then there's a certain kind of covenant language and ritual, and sometimes that is signed instead of with a pen and ink. It's you cut an animal in half, saying if I violate the promise, may the animal here that's cut in half be like what happens to me if this doesn't come to pass, which is actually what we find in the Bible all over the place. We find that in the Abrahamic covenant of Genesis 15, animals are cut in half. It's referenced in Jeremiah, and God even says, if I will cut you in half like the animals that were cut in half in the ritual covenantal treaty. So that's the single-sided promise, where it's only one person making the promise. I'm going to give you X. Okay, that's a promisorial one-sided treaty. And then another kind of treaty that was very common was where there are 2 parties. There's the great king and the lesser kings, and the suzerain and vassal. Sometimes you hear the language, and that is where it's instead of like a gift where you're giving land and they become the owner, it's more like a tenant agreement where the landlord is saying, here, I'm allowing you to live in my land, but you have to abide by these terms. And that is what we find in the Mosaic covenant, I would argue, it's kind of like a two-party agreement where who is doing the swearing is the key. In Genesis 15, which I would argue is a single-sided, one-sided treaty, God is the one making the promises. He's the one that walks through the animal slices. And then in the Mosaic covenant, the people are the one who swear the oath, and they're the ones who are making the promises. All these things we will do. It's a two-party agreement, and ultimately they're more like tenants. In fact, Leviticus 25 actually says this. There's a verse, I think it's verse 23 of Leviticus 25. God says, the land is mine, and you reside in my land as foreigners and strangers. Some translations have that as aliens and tenants. And that's certainly consistent with Jesus' language in the parable of the great tenants, where he talks about the vineyard is representative of Israel. The people are the tenants, and they have not been producing its fruit. And God sends the servants, the prophets, to say, look, I'm here to collect my fruit. And they kill the prophets. And ultimately they kill the son because they think he's the heir. So the whole idea of thinking of the Mosaic covenant as a two-party covenant that is more like a landlord agreement. So God is the owner of the land. It is not a gift. It's God is allowing the people to live in the land, and they have obligations as the tenants of that landlord agreement. You don't have, if you become the owner of the land, you get to do what you want with the land. You could act, you could eat pig. You could do whatever you want. It's your land. But according to the rules of this landlord, Israel had to abide by the Mosaic law, and that we can get into, the further implications of that. But that's sort of the difference between the single party and the two-party treaty. And the ultimate issue is who's swearing the promise.
And you hinted at this answer, but just to clarify, when are we first introduced by God, the covenant of grace in the Bible? Does it occur before the fall in the garden or after?
To the covenant of grace. Well, I definitely think there are promises being made. You find in Genesis 3:15 that sort of proto-evangelion, God is making a promise. At this stage in my own theological development, I'm kind of hesitant to make any covenant applications where you don't find the language of covenant. But we certainly want to talk about there is a promise. It's a huge part of the progress of redemption. God is promising that he will send a seed who will crush the serpent. Okay. And that ends up being sort of, you have different layers. Ultimately, for me, like when you read the language of God made a covenant, in Hebrew, it's karat barit. It's the cutting of a covenant. Yeah. And so I want to tie the language of covenants to covenantal ceremonies that are in space and time. The first language of covenant that appears in the Bible is in the time of Noah. So there's a Noahic covenant, and the sign of the covenant is the rainbow. And so there are particular, what really gets important though, the most important one is the Abrahamic covenant, which you begin having hints of in chapter 12, but mostly that chapter 15 ceremony where God is the one that cuts the animal pieces. He's the one that walks through the halves, making the promises, and that's a promisorial covenant, and Paul alludes to it in the book of Galatians.
Yeah, Nick, perfect. Do you have the new questions in front of you?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
Take a pause. Yeah, we can cut something out. I'm sorry. I thought I had the new questions right in front of me. Did I ask an old question, Shane?
Yeah, you asked old questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, we can totally cut that out and redo the question. I thought I pulled up the new email. So I'm glad Peter said something. So I have the email from June 4th. Let me see. Now, was the question before that one okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
The one I'm looking at is, can you describe what goes on in a covenant ceremony?
Oh, I must have pulled up. I apologize. I must have pulled up the wrong email. Okay. No worries. You probably did. I know there was a couple back and forth, so it was probably my mistake. I pulled up the wrong one. So let me go back.
June 5th, it should be up.
We could totally edit that part out and redo it, Shane. Yeah, sorry about that.
I was like,
I could tell that that might not. Okay, so June 5th, you said? Peter?
Yeah, it was just after that.
Let me see.
June 5th at 7:40 p.m.
Do you mind re-forwarding it to me just so it's fresh in my box?
Yeah.
I don't want to confuse it.
There. Let me actually. Yes, you should have. Let me see. Okay. There. With your questions on it, or the questions assigned to you. I just
Okay.
forwarded it.
Yeah, I'll reload my box. Yeah, sorry about that again. I was confident this when I pulled it up. I was like, oh, these are the. Okay. So I have 3.
Did you originally see those or no?
I mean, I thought I did. Maybe I didn't. Maybe they. Okay, so either way, we'll figure it out. So
I'm gonna take 1 second. I'll be back in 1 minute.
yeah,
Go for it. I was confused about your question. I was like, oh,
yeah. Okay. So we're good up until that question. I'll read
because you did get them because you asked me, are we still calling this covenant of grace or something
no,
else?
you did. It was just my mistake. I probably just pulled up the wrong one.
Okay.
It's
I
all
was
good.
making sure. I was like, I'm pretty sure I sent it to him, but I was making sure.
Got it. Okay. So do I need to re-ask?
I probably would, yeah, because he
So
answered the question you should have asked. So I'm trying to figure out how to.
So do I
this.
we'll pause and then do I ask these new questions number 3? Which we actually
no,
haven't
he
had
already
answers.
answered that.
Okay, so number 5.
Yeah, I'll go next. Yeah, because I'll
So you
yeah,
have
because I
number
didn't want
4.
to really put him on the spot.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we haven't had actually an explanation of what the covenant is in Scripture, though we throw the term out.
That's what he answered.
Okay. So we answered that. How about we take a pause? You ask number 4, and then I'll go to 5.
Yeah, and I'm gonna
Okay.
cut the one that you asked on the parties. Not like
That's
we
fine.
don't need it, but it's just yeah, I had agreed with him that we weren't gonna ask that one.
Yeah, no, totally. So does that mean I need to re-ask number 3 then?
No, because he's already answered it.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, I'll
Okay.
just ask so ask your stuff, and then I'll ask my first question will be number 5.
Yeah.
And then I'll do 5, 6, and 8.
Yeah.
Sorry. It was a confusing one with the back and forth stuff. I think I just mixed.
All good. Yeah.
So 5, 6.
Brennan will have a fun time trying to edit this one.
I'm glad you said something because
because I had the new questions and I knew you had the new ones because you responded to it. But and then when you asked your question, I was like, oh, he's using the old questions.
All right. Sorry about that, Shane.
No
that
problem.
Was a very rare mistake. So we'll pause. Don't worry. You have our word. We will edit that part out.
If you want to use parts of that, it's fine.
And
no, I think there's a better way of, so the way that you responded to the second one, there's a better way of asking the question to get to your response versus what was asked previously.
Right.
So Pete, we'll take a pause so our editor knows, and then Peter's probably just going to jump right to number 4, right?
Because you answered, had Nick asked number 3, you answered that. So we don't need to rehash that one. So I'll go straight into 4.
All right.
Because it's a relatively I mean, as you know, it's like kind of a logical next question to number 3.
Right.
Okay, cool.
Okay. And I'll start after a little break. So similar to how you just responded to Nick, the cutting ceremonies, some of the differences between the parties with Abraham, with Moses, it's a rather big difference between Presbyterian and Baptist way of reading Scripture, among other differences I'm sure we can talk about. But is the covenant made with Abraham, as you talked about, cutting through the severed halves, who's walking through that and who's given the promises versus the one given to Moses? How should we understand the difference between Abraham and Moses? This is pretty crucial for these covenant ceremonies. And what happens if we begin to blend these two covenants together, or these two kind of ceremonies together?
Yeah. I remember reading something from Mortimer Adler once, I think in one of his introductions to philosophy, just the very beginning, like if you're off 1 degree here, you will end up being thousands of miles off course later on if it's a long voyage, you know. And in biblical studies, you can't mess up the covenants because it has huge implications. And understanding the difference between the Abrahamic covenants and the Mosaic covenants, just a couple of texts come to mind for me. One of them is in, I think, Deuteronomy 5, where we find this language that the covenant that God is making at Mount Sinai is not going to be like the covenant that he made with the fathers, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And similarly, in the promise of the new covenant in Jeremiah 31:31, we find the same language, that the new covenant is not going to be like the one that God made at Mount Sinai. So there are these different covenants, and I guess the challenge would be like when you see the new covenant and they're starting to wrestle with these important issues, like, you know, should we, Acts 15, should we require Gentiles to live like Jews? And, you know, the answer is no, actually, it's a different covenant. Paul talking about the fact that we're not under law. All these things come to play as we understand these crucial issues. And so to think about the Abrahamic covenant, it's a promisorial covenant. And the sign of that covenant was circumcision. It was promisorial. That was the covenantal sign. It's kind of marking them off as a people, and it's a people with a promise. And ultimately, if you think about Paul's language in Galatians 3 and 4, it's protecting the community that can be like a vessel to carry that promise forward through time. And a lot of our theologians, Reformed theologians, Calvin and others, would say, you know, there's a weirdness to the Mosaic covenant. All these laws weren't necessarily like the best way for society to be run. You don't need to apply the laws of Moses to every society. There's some wisdom here we can take, but we don't have to be Jews. We shouldn't apply all the commands of Moses to secular society. This is common in Reformed theology. So, and you see it in Acts 15. So Abrahamic covenant, it's promisorial. It is, there's hope the birds aren't going to distract us.
It's a good background noise.
It's promisorial, whereas the Mosaic covenant it's sort of, these are obligations. Now, you know, the people were slaves in Egypt, and now they're God's servants, and they have to obey these stipulations in order to stay in the land. But that all is tied up in, will there be a people to carry the promise forward? A people who are closely paying attention to the words of the promise over time. And so, but each different stage here is going to be a different kind of arrangement. And in the Mosaic covenant, it's a do this and live. Do this and live. In Genesis 15, it's Abraham believed and he was credited as righteous.
Exactly.
So he believed the promise. Now, was he a perfect believer? There's a point when you see him falling on his face, laughing at the promise, right?
At the end of Genesis 12, you realize, like,
believer.
He's not that good. At Genesis 16, he's not that good. In Genesis 18, he's not that good.
No, he's an imperfect. He's a pagan, and God interrupts the pagan with a promise. And but there's enough there in Genesis 15 where he's like, okay, I'll believe you. But then there's also the line where he's like, but how will I know for sure?
Exactly.
But so anyway, God interrupts the pagan with a promise, and he still continues to live as a pagan, although a reformed pagan. Look at Isaac and Jacob, same issues. They are reformed pagans. They're not perfect by any means, but they're carrying the promise forward. And then throughout that, the engagement with these particular Canaanite pagans' lives, God continues to tell his story. And ultimately that story is foreshadowed and and typified in so many different ways, especially through the Mosaic system and the sacrificial system. That's how we get the meaning of what Christ accomplished, was through all the foreshadowing.
Yeah.
We wouldn't understand the sacrifice on the cross if it weren't for all that sort of the history of what atonement means and what it means to have God's wrath propitiated, through the mercy seat. And Jesus is the mercy seat, Paul says. All that becomes the way in which we think about the substance, but all that was foreshadowing. Christ is the substance. And the Mosaic covenant was primarily there, not as like the perfect example of how to run a society, but the perfect way to keep a people who would carry that promise forward.
Totally. Gotcha. Cool.
Yeah, and so often when a broadly evangelical Christian goes through scripture, goes through the Bible, and the Old Testament in particular, Jesus Christ doesn't immediately just jump off the page. His name isn't clearly there. I mean, he's pre-incarnate at this time, and grace may be a familiar concept, but Christ in the Old Testament seems like we're trying to find him where he never was. And we know as Reformed Christians that know the Bible really well, grace isn't just a New Testament thing. But so, however, as much as of your writing at White Horse Inn and your podcast to do the same, and your really special, passionate interest in Christ in the Old Testament, in general, can you explain why it's so vital to see Christ in the Old Testament for this?
Yeah, I think I remember recording an interview with Ian Duguid, another Westminster Seminary prof, who went off to go to which institution? He's a school in Pittsburgh, Grove City College. He went to Grove City. He said when Horton published Christless Christianity, thought it was overstated.
Yeah.
And then he went to Grove City, where he had to sort of, watch a lot of these pastors and assistant pastors give their chapel talks.
So, yeah.
And where it was basically, Christianity as therapy. It's become a better you. It's 5 principles for this and that. And Christ isn't there. So there's a twofold problem. The number one problem, and so anyway, in my interview with Dr. Duguid, he was saying how, it's actually worse than Horton states in his book, Christless Christianity. Because what we do is we go to the Bible looking, how can I be David? And how can I battle the Goliaths in my life? I'm reading the Bible with me at the center.
Yeah.
And I'm not even looking for finding Christ. And then another problem is when you look for Christ in bizarre ways, it's not consistent with the grain of Scripture.
Yep.
So I remember the first Christian church that I went to after converting from Jewish background and atheistic views was Calvary Chapel. And Calvary Chapel was a Bible church, and they did try to focus on Christ, even in the Old Testament, but sometimes they did it in interesting ways. And you see this sometimes where even in the ancient church, where there's this allegorical method, and you find you have the scene where in the Old Testament, Moses throws the wood into the water, and the water was bitter, and then it becomes sweet. And so the allegory here is the wood represents the cross, and the bitterness is our sin. And so, but it's sort of pulling rabbits out of hats. Like, is it the allegorical method ends up being
serving your ends versus the texts.
Yeah, it may actually not, it may just be that you're reading it into instead of reading it out of. It's eisegesis instead of exegesis. And so you got to applaud people for at least trying to find Christ in the Old Testament.
Totally, yeah.
But on the other hand, it has to be consistent with the actual text. Now, my emphasis, especially in the last 10 years or so, is not to talk about Christ as hinted at, foreshadowed in the Old Testament, but actually to find those places where Jesus is really there.
Yeah, exactly. The substance of Christ is actually in the text, not like, oh, he's some distance far off. We can kind of see him a little bit. No, he's actually right here.
Yeah. So you don't even have to look for types. I mean, think about what Paul says in his epistles. No one has seen God. Jesus says this too. No one has seen the Father, but only the Son who has revealed him. Jesus, Paul's the one who says Jesus is the image of the invisible God.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if people haven't seen God, and Jesus is the one who reveals him, and if God is invisible, and you find that language of Jesus is the one sent by the Father, that's the major language we find in the Gospel of John. I am sent by the Father. You find that 40, 50 times. But actually, that's the same language you find in the Old Testament with regard to the manifestations of this interesting character who represents himself as Yahweh, but is also sent by Yahweh. And some translations, it'll be the angel of the Lord. I think the best translation is the Malach, the ambassador of Yahweh. The ambassador, it's not an angel as we think of angels. In fact, our own pictures of angels, winged creatures, is actually more pagan deities.
Yeah, they're entirely inaccurate. Yeah.
So an angel could just be a representative, but the angel of the Lord, the messenger, the ambassador of Yahweh, is the one who is sent by Yahweh, but also speaks and acts as Yahweh. This is the one who appears to Abraham. Sometimes Abraham is there with Yahweh showing up with a couple other messengers, but Abraham brings a bowl of water so that God can wash his feet. So that's a physical manifestation of Yahweh. And so in some cases, there are two Yahwehs in the passage. Yahweh refers to Yahweh.
Yeah.
Anytime you have a physical presentation of Yahweh, you have to think this is the second person of the Trinity. This view goes back to the ancient church.
Yep.
So rethink the Old Testament. Many of the places you just think in terms of a generic God is there. It's actually Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, in a pre-incarnate state.
Yes.
And especially it's evident when you find that language of the angel of the Lord, or the ambassador of the covenant.
Yeah, that's important. Before next, and just a quick little comment. And I was intrigued by our email conversation, because it does tend, like, we can tend to speak about the covenant of grace in kind of ethereal, atemporal, kind of not historical, on the ground reality of the substance, versus, like, again, just like kind of over the surface, 30,000 foot level promise that's coming in the future, versus no, this is a concrete reality that they experienced in the Old Testament, because it was a concrete covenant ceremony made with them. So they got to see the promises right in front of them. Of course, the fulfillment, the consummation of all things wasn't until Christ's actual incarnation, but they got to see some of these things. They got to experience some of these things, versus just, oh, this is like some like weird promises coming in right now, but like we still have to wait for it. But no, actually they experienced it.
Yep.
Yeah. And to add to that, in other words, practically speaking, it's so helpful that you explain that, because we can see and understand how Old Testament saints were saved.
Yeah.
And Abraham had the same faith we do. He just didn't know Jesus Christ's name, but he had faith in the same person we do.
Yeah.
He had the same faith we do. And there's so much typology pointing to Christ in the Old Testament.
Yeah. For example, one of the scenes that I think about along those lines is Genesis 32, where you have Jacob actually is wrestling with this strange figure in the dark. And I'm convinced he doesn't know who it is. He probably assumes it's his brother, because that's the one he was fearing.
He was running away from him.
Running away from his brother, fearing his brother, moving his family away to the other side of the river, because he thought his brother's going to come and attack him. And he gets attacked in the night. What's he going to think? Well, in the middle of that, he's confused, and he says, "Well, what is your name?" And this it turns out to be God who's there in the flesh, which would be second person. He says, "Why did you ask my name?" There's another scene later on in the book of Judges, actually the parents of Samson.
Judges 13,
who when they ask the same question of this angel of the Lord, and he says, "Why is it you ask my name, seeing it is wonderful?"
Which is Yahweh language through and through.
Added development here. And then you get to Isaiah, his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God. So you have that sort of continuing, more depth is being added to this one. In that case, in Isaiah 9, it's this child will be born. His name will be Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God. It's God who will be born. But it's the same one who wrestled with Jacob and named him Israel, the one who struggles with God.
Fascinating. That is so cool. I think you explained a couple examples, but if you could give us maybe a couple more, what are some examples of Christ in the Old Testament? Maybe one or two familiar stories, and
Yeah.
maybe a story that's a little less obvious on the surface.
Yeah. Well, if you think about that language of the angel of Yahweh who speaks as Yahweh. So one famous scene is the burning bush, where it's not just God. This is the scene where you find that great I am language. I am who I am. But it's the angel of Yahweh, the one sent by Yahweh, who ends up being introduced in the beginning of that scene. So again, it's the language consistent with our view of the second person of the Trinity. But that same individual was right there in Genesis 22 with the story of Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac. So we have here at the very place, if you kind of picture that scene, they're supposed to go back to the land of Moriah, which is the hills around Jerusalem. They are given Abraham was given the instruction to put his son to death, to sacrifice his son, which in that age was not uncommon.
Yeah, people are like, oh, okay, I've heard about this before.
Sacrifice, but this particular command is actually intended to undermine, to subvert the entire process. Like Israel must know we are not to do this. And just like you should have no images becomes the Mosaic command, it's basically wiping the whiteboard clear with all the idols, because Jesus is the image of the invisible God. You wipe the chalkboard off and make it clean so that you can be prepared for one image. Same with the sacrificial system. No child sacrifice. We're going to have only one place will be authorized to do it, out on every high hill. One place for sacrifice. So animals, but zero child sacrifice. So Israel was unique in that way. It was kind of common throughout the ancient world. Wow. So anyway, Abraham is told to go sacrifice your son, but then the whole thing is undermined. And the language from the angel of Yahweh, the messenger of the covenant, the very language is, on this mountain, there will be a sacrifice. So God's this particular mountain, they were there in that general vicinity of what would later become Golgotha. And that's where the ultimate sacrifice, the lamb, will be provided. And in its future tense too. So if you think about it, though, being the second person of the Trinity who is doing the speaking, he's actually what's being typified and hinted. It's Jesus who is actually there in the text doing the promising about his own redemption. And what's being typified and promised is the actual act. I find that same kind of thing in Genesis 32. If you think about Jacob's wrestling with the angel, it's Augustine has a really interesting take on this. It's actually what's being prefigured is Golgotha, because how did Jacob win? A lot of commentators, when they read this, they say the important takeaway is that we need to struggle and hold on to God and refuse to let him go until we get the things we're demanding. Yeah. But that grabbing, seizing, clinging is actually always the negative thing throughout the book of Genesis. And what happens is Jacob is afraid when he realizes that it was God in the flesh. And that's when he realizes that he didn't actually get this by conquering. He got it because God condescended in weakness. And Augustine points this out. It was God's condescension to allow himself to be beaten, which is actually how Jacob comes into the land. Yep. And that's how we enter the ultimate promised land too, by God's weakness, by the cross, by God's allowing himself in flesh to be led up to Golgotha and to be crucified for us. So it's the same story. The story is what's being typified in that passage is Golgotha, the ultimate, the cross. But the person who is there is actually Jesus himself.
That's so helpful. I've thought about that before because it was confusing to me until you clarified it. Is obviously Jesus as God, he could clearly, if he wanted to, beat him. Exactly. So I was like, why?
Yeah, which is the same at the cross. People were asking him, hey, like, get off the cross and go defeat them.
Come down. Yeah.
Yeah, it's these are, and this is what's so fascinating about what we call like kind of the substance of the covenant, the one who's come, who is the fulfillment of these promises. It's not just kind of laying these on top. We get to see how it's actually played out throughout redemptive history. And so digging into this a little bit, you've been very influenced by T. David Gordon and his book, Promise, Law, Faith. I think I have that off the top of my head, which I read last year, preparing for Galatians. And he has one of the best treatments, I thought, of Galatians out there, and especially his relationship between the Mosaic covenant and Christ, and for lack of better words. So how has his work helped you better understand, as you say in your own words, though, like, obviously there's still formulation and theological formation to come through, and we see this with the works principle, with the grace principle, law, gospel, guardianship in the law, etc. So if you can explain maybe how this helps us better understand the substance throughout redemptive history.
Yeah, Gordon, who is a friend, is really helpful on this. He's also writing another commentary on the book of Romans that is forthcoming. But I interviewed him about his book, Promise, Law, Faith, when it came out. And so if you just type in that name on the White Horse Insight, you can find that interview. Super helpful in illuminating Galatians. Galatians is such a clear book that it makes the contrast between the Mosaic covenant and then the new covenant. And that what it keeps emphasizing is that the Mosaic covenant was temporal. And a lot of people, even in Reformed circles, emphasize the eternal nature of the Mosaic things, because there are principles and morals in that covenant that are timeless, you could say, but there are also things woven through the entire thing that are temporal, and what he emphasizes, what David Gordon emphasizes, is that temporal language. These things were there, the law was a schoolmaster until the time of Jesus, and that until language, you even find it in Jesus. The law, he says, was until John. I've actually recently started thinking about, like, I used to think
John the Baptist you're talking about, right?
John the Baptist, yeah. The law was until John, and since then the gospel has been proclaimed. That's what Jesus says. And it's like, what does that mean? So I've recently been toying with the idea that what if Jesus basically fulfills all righteousness up to his baptism and then begins to announce the new covenant? And even, I mean, think about this. Like in John chapter 5, he violates the Sabbath, and John, the narrator of the text, says the Jews wanted to kill him because he said these things and because he was breaking the Sabbath. So how could that be if Jesus is he's born under the law? How can he break the Sabbath? And so some people try and get around that by saying, well, he didn't really break the Sabbath. He was breaking their rules about the Sabbath. But I think John really makes it clear. And other texts, like in Matthew, I think it's 16, it's the scene where they pull the coin out of the fish's mouth. It's the scene which this is the temple tax collectors. So this is a Jewish command from the law of Moses, and they have come to collect the once the yearly temple tax to fund the sacrifices in the temple and all that stuff. And Peter comes to the house. Jesus says, "What do you think, Peter? Do you think that people, like, if you're a king and you're gonna tax people, who do you tax? Like other people, or your own sons, or other people?" And Peter says, "Others. The princes don't get the tax bill. they're the sons." It's like, oh, okay, so the sons are free. And then he says, so that these temple tax collectors aren't offended, go get a coin from the fish's mouth. In other words, you, Peter, as my son, you're free because I am the king. I am the suzerain. I'm the Lord of the temple. But that's going to take a long time to explain to these guys. So just so they're not offended. But he shows he is the Lord, not just of the temple, but of the universe, because he providentially knows where the coin can be found in the fish's mouth. But the point is, he didn't have to pay. He didn't have to pay, which, if the covenant of the Mosaic covenant was still in effect, he would have had to have paid. Peter would, but he's able to now pronounce gospel and to give this sort of free, you're off the hook. And I think that helps us to see, like, I think we have to do some more work on covenant theology to evaluate, like, I mean, one of the things that we don't want to say is that we're now apart from the law.
Yeah.
Because we're not antinomians.
No.
But what Paul says, not that I'm apart from the law, but I'm under the law of Christ.
Yeah. Galatians 6
that
2.
language,
Yeah.
even in the Old Testament, the coastlands are waiting for his law.
Yeah.
So I don't think the coastlands were waiting for the Jewish Messiah to bring Moses to the world.
No.
I think the coastlands were waiting for his law, and his law is outlined in the Sermon on the Mount and at the end of the gospel, Matthew, go into all the world and teach them all the things I have commanded you. I have commanded you. So I think we need to pay closer attention to Christ's law, and the heart of Christ's law is actually the new commandment. And it's not just love one another like you love yourselves. That's the Mosaic law. It's love one another as I have loved you. It's sacrificial love as the heart of the new covenant ethics. I mean, think about how Paul unpacks this in Ephesians. Let the thief who stole steal no longer. Instead, let him work hard so that he may give. The thief is being transformed into a giver, the very opposite of a thief. And there's no capital punishment. Achan in Joshua 7 had capital punishment for stealing. That's the Mosaic covenant, capital punishment. So partly there's, you could think of the it's a theonomic code for the society, Jewish society.
Yep.
Here, there is just no. That's not. We believe in Jesus. We don't just believe it's fire insurance, but we apply it to our lives, and we are redirected from takers to becoming sacrificial givers.
Totally. Yeah. So before Nick's last question, just maybe again trying to explain this by contrast. And we've so rightly distinguished the Mosaic and the Abrahamic covenants. What happens if we start blending those two? If we start say, okay, Abraham, there's the circumcision thing, that's a commandment, or you have to stay in the Abrahamic covenant, or well, no, Moses is really that's kind of gracious. He's brought him into the land, and now this is the Redeemer who's graciously applying these covenants down. This is now how you live. So what happens if we start blending these two covenants, law and grace?
Well, then you'll start to read Jesus and you'll say, instead of thinking about the language that Paul really outlines in Galatians extremely well, that this is about the promise, believing the promise, again, like the Abrahamic covenant, it's more about all these things we will do. And if I do all these things, if I stick in my thumb and pull out a plum, oh, what a good boy am I. And I'm actually, I stay in the covenant by my obedience. Instead of recognizing what the Jews knew all along from Psalm 143, that no one, do not come into judgment with your servant, for no one living is righteous before you. The law's job was to just kind of reveal what's bad, what's corrupt in human nature. And so if you kind of have this idea of all these things we will do, what does Peter say in Acts 15? He says, why would we give them the burden of the laws of Moses when not even our fathers were able to keep these things? Our history has been exile. We've not been able to keep the tenants agreement from the landlord, and that's why we were evicted over and over and over again. So we are not able to keep these. But ultimately they were attempting to reveal that we needed the Redeemer. And now that we have the Redeemer by faith, we have the promises by faith. And now, so it's not do this and live, it's live in Christ and now do these things. Yeah. So we just if you confuse the covenants, you get the cart before the horse, and it leads to Pelagianism, It confuses everything to talk about, and you lose justification. Sanctification becomes the thing you focus on. You focus on you and all the good things you do. Martin Luther, says, no, here I stand. It's all of grace. It's all Christ. It's all about faith alone. That's what we need to recover. And the covenants need to be distinguished, or else it creates that mess.
Totally. Yeah.
And we've said this before too. I think we even mentioned on the Covenant of Works episode, we need to know what we're saved from in order to really understand the grace part, because the drama, as Michael Horton talks about, the drama really comes before is the guilt part. and that comes before the grace part. So understanding what we're saved from to really appreciate and see the gravity of the grace that Christ gives us. And we love talking to you about Christ, seeing Christ in the Old Testament. This is so much fun. So the last question we have is, being that we find Christ in the Old Testament, especially so upon apostolic authority and their hermeneutical example, practically speaking, though, how do they believe upon Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, the promised one, if they didn't know his name yet for so many centuries?
Yeah, if he was there, then why didn't they say, "Oh yeah, I believe in Jesus"? And that's what Paul says. "Oh yeah, you do this too."
Yeah. Well, first of all, the first part of that, the apostolic authority and the hermeneutical examples. Okay, so when you are reading through the book of Acts, what do you see them doing?
Mm-hmm.
You see them again and again proclaiming what they have seen with their eyes and other witnesses, that which was the expectation of the Hebrew prophets. So all the promises and prophecies of the coming Messiah have been fulfilled in our own experience. We saw this, we hung out with him, and you yourselves know, because Jesus was proclaimed as a famous miracle worker. I mean, just look up the word fame and crowds. Everywhere Jesus goes, he's famous in Syria, the Decapolis, and Jerusalem and Judea. How can you make up a story? How could that be made up? How could it be persuasive if that wasn't true? Everybody would know it's a lie, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as you yourselves know, Peter says to the crowd in Jerusalem, Acts 2, and these things have been attested to by his signs and wonders, that which we've seen with our eyes, it's fulfilling. And then he's quoting all these different prophecies. He's quoting from Psalm 16 and the book of Joel. And there's even lines throughout his sermons about the righteous one, hinting at Isaiah 53. So you have all these great promises and prophecies. That's the substance of apostolic preaching. They're preaching Christ throughout all the Old Testament. And it's not just something that's going to come. It has happened. We were witnesses, and therefore you should repent and believe. And that's, then what you find is like 3,000 and 5,000 and tens of thousands, and then vast multitudes. That's in decade after decade of the Christian movement, even attested to by pagan sources. All right, so that's the first part. The second part is, how could the Old Testament figures be saved? Well, we are saved by looking back to what has been revealed in its fullness.
Mm-hmm.
But they were looking forward, and they trusted, like Abraham, he trusted the promise
mm-hmm.
without having all the specificity of how it would be accomplished, or even the specific name of the one child who would be born. But they did have enough to go on. They were told that there would come a time when these things would be revealed. Abraham, we already talked about Genesis 22. On this mountain, it shall be provided. What? The ultimate sacrifice. And so what is Abraham in chapter 15? Abraham believes the promise that God will, separate him from the nations, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. He believes that, and it's credited to him as righteousness. So you're believing according to the level of the promise that's made up until that time, not in its fullness, but in its shadow. So it's we talk about the progress of redemption. They're believing, and it makes perfect sense too. In the beginning stage, it's actually the second person of the Trinity making the promises often. He's the one there. So it's not like they need to. There are times when they're asking, "What's your name?" But it's sort of, well, why do you ask?
Yeah.
I love that. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
But other times it's sort of, more depth and detail is added, and you go from sort of the general promise, and then you got the bones, and you got the flesh on the bones, and then finally in chapter 2 of Luke's gospel, there's the boy in the cradle,
mm-hmm.
and he's got a name, and then a couple of different priests and a lady named Anna, like, oh, here's the expected promised Messiah that everyone's been looking for. So I hope that helps to clarify. We're saved we're saved by the same person.
Yeah.
But the person was revealed in type and shadow, sometimes by his own lips, he's revealing what he himself will do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that's amazing. It's amazing. But know that, or there's another scene too, like in the book of Exodus, where God says, I will lead you. You must do what I say. Oh, and I will send you my servant, an angel who will, you must listen to him and follow his words. And if you don't, he will not forgive your sins. Wait, I thought it was only God who could forgive sins. So this angel has the power of forgiveness too.
Yeah.
And he will lead you to the place where you are to go. What does Jesus say in the book, Gospel of John? I am the way, the truth, and life, and I will prepare a place for you. He's fulfilling all the same kind of language that we find back in the Old Testament. And it becomes meaningful when we really understand the initial promises, because all the New Testament is built on the foundation of that sort of Exodus and coming into the land. That's a type for us to understand our ultimate inheritance of the ultimate city of Jerusalem, the ultimate promised land.
That makes sense. It's progressively through time revealed to us more and more.
Yes.
But they had the exact same faith
Yeah.
as we do.
Yes. And
it's,
Paul says that. He says that rock was Christ. They don't have a different thing. There in the wilderness, Moses strikes the rock. Yahweh was standing on the rock, and it comes out lots of water, and it feeds and it gives them the nourishing water of life. Jesus adds another dimension to it in his statements. He gives the water of eternal life. So they had the bread from heaven and they had water of life, but it was temporal. And so was the land. But here now we're dealing with the eternal, and that's the big difference. But it was still the same one who is making the promises and ultimately fulfilling them.
That's really good. Yeah. But before I leave you off, maybe if you can describe people, I mean, as concise as you can, if we lose Christ in the Old Testament, if we forget where he's at, if we forget about his promises, forget what he's done to fulfill us, what happens to our preaching? What happens to our kind of Christian life when we lose Christ in the Old Testament?
Well, it just becomes a big morality tale. It's Aesop's fables. It's self-help genre. Become a better David, become a better Joshua, tear down these walls. And, but it's all, you end up becoming the center. And these are just character types so that you can improve.
Yeah.
And that's just, some call it narcigesis. It's a great way to think about it, that reading ourselves into the story, like these are just models, heroes for me. And ultimately the story of the Bible isn't about the heroes of Abraham or Joshua or David. If you look at all the characters, they're completely flawed characters who carry the promise forward. And in some ways, the flaws are so striking that you're thinking, how could this possibly be a holy book? Abraham here is like, he's afraid that Pharaoh's going to kill him to take the wife. And so he actually says, here, join his harem. Like, wait,
not just once, he does it twice.
How could this be a thing? And then his son does the same thing. Abraham does it a couple times. His son does the same thing. Fast forward to David. David is the very man of Abraham's nightmares. He is the king who takes the wife and kills the husband. How could he be the holy guy in the story? How's he the good guy? I thought he was the slayer of Goliath. He's a wicked pagan who is here we just see sin sort of amplified, but also what's amplified in the story is grace in the midst of that. So Psalm 51 really sort of crystallizes that, yes, even this is something that atonement can cleanse. What does Jesus do when he comes? He resolves all that, because he did not fear being killed. And his death ends up he doesn't defile his bride, but he actually makes her clean from all defilement.
That's
an amazing story. There's no other story like this.
No. Any other holy book you read the Quran, if you read Book of Mormon, if you read anything else, it will lift up just about every character. And of course, the Bible lifts up Christ, but that's all that really lifts up is Christ, and nobody else is like, you don't want to be like these other guys. They looked at Christ and said, no, that's the one we put our faith on.
Yep.
I've heard too, the mistake is navel gazing, and instead you should lift your eyes up towards Christ.
Yeah, some of the Latin theologians used to talk about sin as incurvitas. So it's being curved in on ourselves, which, kind of when you're curved in yourself, what do? You can only see your navel.
That's right. Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah, and I love how you described it. It's so often if we lose Christ in the Old Testament, if we lose the grace in the Old Testament, we lose the law gospel distinction. We will look at some of these characters as types that we can try to embody versus types that point forward to Christ and says, no, you don't want to embody those people. You don't want to copy those people.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's all you're going to embody is those people, when your faith should be placed on the one who did not embody those people, who fulfilled everything that they failed. And your faith is placed on that one.
The Bible is not like a manual with rules of how we can climb to heaven.
Yeah.
It's a story about God's descent
to
rescue us at the bottom of the ladder, because we're dead, just like Jacob was in, chapter 28 of Genesis.
Yeah. It's so much assurance too, because God chose those people. God chose Abraham. God chose David. And you could see explicitly that they don't immediately become glorified. They screw up big time, and he still carries them through on his back.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
There's a line from Bono from U2 where he talks about, he used to be offended at all the scoundrels in the Bible.
Oh, yeah.
And then later, as he got older, he said it actually became a source of great comfort.
Yeah.
It's a great observation.
I could see myself there. It's comforting knowing that I don't have to kind of whitewash myself before I come to the cross. I'm coming to the cross with everything that makes me who I am.
And the longer you live, the more you realize that you're not as much shocked by King David and what he did, because you are he.
Oh yeah.
You are. What does Jesus say in John 10? He says something very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
All who came before me were thieves and robbers.
Yep. Yeah. He does not make any distinction whatsoever.
Thinking about the false messiahs, but that's actually the same language that Nathan had to David. Nathan said, there's a story about this one guy, he has one sheep, and there's another guy with lots of sheep. And, but the wealthy guy steals the sheep, and then you are that man.
Yeah.
You're a thief. And you're supposed to be the man after God's own heart, but you're a thief. Jesus says that in John 10. All who came before me were thieves and robbers. All of us have stolen a little bit from God's glory.
Yeah.
And we're false shepherds. And so
it's right in the middle of his good shepherd discourse.
I'm going to come and shepherd my people.
Yeah.
That reminds me of Jacob too. He was a scoundrel. And we saw what God did through the line of Jacob, despite everybody's scoundrel.
Everybody not named Jesus was a scoundrel.
Yeah.
Well, even the name Jacob itself, the name Jacob means the struggle, scoundrel, deceiver, schemer.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Well, Shane, thank you so much for coming on our show, for talking to us about the substance, the covenant of grace, about the covenants, how they're initiated, the difference between Abraham and Moses, how we see Christ in the Old Testament, how we see faith in the Old Testament, how we can read our Bibles better with Christ at the center of it, not with ourselves at the center of it. It's been a pleasure having you on. So I want you to plug your podcast, what you're doing, so people know where to find you.
Yeah. Before I plug my podcast, there's 2 books I would recommend in this. One, an academic book by Michael Horton. It's called Covenant and Salvation. Yeah. If you have any of your fans who
4-volume dogmatics, which is one of the hardest books I've ever read in my entire life.
Well, the series, but this particular book, the first few chapters are not too bad, but he walks through some of this kind of Meredith Klein stuff, Covenant and Salvation. So that's the pointy-headed sort of academic volume. And then an easier volume would be Sacred Bond, Covenant and Salvation by Mike Brown and Zach Heel. Very easy to read book on walking through the covenants. We also mentioned Promised Law of Faith by David Gordon. My podcast, it's easy to find at humbleskeptic.com. Humbleskeptic.com. I've got lots of podcasts and articles that mostly I've been focusing on this first year of my podcast. I've been focusing on faith. What is it? And is it rational and reasonable? Is it blind? How have we misunderstood that? That's what I've been exploring lately.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Shane, for coming on our show, for talking to us about all these things. And I hope people can. I listened to your first episode. I listened to your most recent episode with Fikret Bocek from Westminster. Listened to it 2 days ago. And I recommend the podcast for those for who are either wrestling with these questions or want to know more about their faith and just what you're talking about. So thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, guys.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you so much.